Emily, Sarah, and Claire were the kind of girls everyone in town knew: bright, popular, full of life. But while their smiles lit up classrooms and hallways, a boy named Daniel sat quietly in the shadows, watching them with an intensity no one else noticed. What seemed like harmless silence was in fact the beginning of an obsession that would twist into something the entire world would one day witness. It all started in a small town that most people would describe as safe, quiet, and ordinary. Families moved there because they believed nothing bad could happen. The schools were good, neighbors greeted each other in the morning, and life followed a routine. On weekends, the local park was filled with laughter, while the main street buzzed with coffee shops, diners, and small stores that had been there for decades. The town seemed frozen in time, like a postcard of suburban life that promised comfort and predictability. But beneath that polished image, there were undercurrents no one could see. Among the many teenagers walking the halls of the high school was a boy who always kept to himself. His classmates knew his name, but most couldn't remember ever having a real conversation with him. He sat in the back of classrooms, scribbling in notebooks, rarely raising his hand. Teachers described him as quiet, polite, and unremarkable. He blended into the background so well that most people forgot he was even there. Yet in his silence, something unsettling was forming. For years, the town had believed in the idea of safety. People left their doors unlocked, children rode bikes until dusk, and everyone trusted that bad things happened somewhere else. That belief blinded them to small warnings. The teen began showing up in places where he didn't belong, hanging around outside of activities he wasn't part of, watching instead of participating. At first, it didn't raise alarm. Teenagers are awkward, people said. They go through phases. But his behavior was not just awkwardness, it was fixation. He had noticed a group of 3 girls, popular in school for their friendliness and energy. They excelled academically, joined sports teams, and seemed to shine wherever they went. To most people, they were ordinary teenagers trying to balance schoolwork, friendships, and their plans for the future. But to him, they became something else entirely. He watched them walk to class, memorized where they sat at lunch, and scrolled endlessly through their social media. Each post, each photo, each casual detail became part of an invisible map he was building. In a place where parents thought nothing could go wrong, no one noticed the lines being crossed. The girls laughed when they saw him standing too close in the hallway, brushing it off as harmless. Friends whispered that he just had a crush and nothing more. Even adults didn't sense the danger. The truth was simple but terrifying. The small town that prided itself on knowing everyone had missed the fact that someone among them was watching, waiting, and planning. While life in the town went on with school dances, football games, and Saturday nights at the diner, the boy's world was shrinking. His thoughts revolved around the 3 girls until nothing else mattered. He was invisible to most, but to himself, he believed he had found his purpose. The quiet suburb with its picket fences and cheerful parades was about to learn that even the safest places can hide the darkest secrets. What began as silent curiosity soon grew into an unhealthy fixation. At first, the boy's interest in the 3 girls seemed harmless to anyone who might have noticed. Teenagers often admire their peers from afar, and crushes are part of high school life, but this was different. He wasn't just admiring them, he was studying them. Every day he paid close attention to where they walked, what time they left class, which path they took home. He didn't interact with them, yet he knew the rhythms of their lives with unsettling accuracy. His notebooks filled with details that seemed meaningless on their own but dangerous when combined. He sketched maps of hallways and sidewalks, noting where the girls usually stopped to talk. He wrote down the times they posted online and the locations tagged in their photos. He tracked patterns that no one else would care about, like which coffee shop they preferred on Thursdays or how often they stayed after school for sports practice. The more he learned, the more powerful he felt, as if he had control over them without ever speaking to them. Classmates sometimes saw him standing nearby but rarely thought twice. He lingered in corners during group activities, eyes locked on the girls without saying a word. At football games, he positioned himself just far enough away to avoid notice, yet close enough to watch. On weekends, he appeared in unexpected places, like outside the store where they shopped or at the park where they met friends. Each time, he stood quietly, watching, waiting, blending into the background until his presence became almost invisible. The girls occasionally mentioned it to one another, laughing nervously. To them, it was unsettling but not alarming. They were used to attention people whispered about their clothes, their popularity, their successes. A boy watching from a distance seemed odd but not threatening. Friends teased that he probably had a crush, and that was where the conversation ended. Nobody imagined his fixation was growing darker by the day. As months passed, the obsession shifted from fascination to possession. He no longer saw the girls as individuals with their own lives, but as pieces in a world he thought belonged to him. Their laughter in the hallways became a sound he wanted to capture and keep. Their movements felt like signals directed only at him, even though they didn't know he existed in the way he imagined. Reality blurred with his fantasies, and in his mind, he began to believe he was part of their lives, even though they had never invited him in. Behind closed doors, the boy surrounded himself with reminders. Screenshots of their social media filled his devices. Scraps of paper with their initials covered his desk. He replayed moments in his mind, the flicker of a smile, the brush of a hand against a locker, and twisted them into stories where he played the central role. The more he fed this inner world, the further he drifted from reality. No teacher noticed the change, and no friend was close enough to see what was happening. On the outside, he was still just a quiet kid who went to class and did his work. But inside, the fixation had taken root and was spreading like a shadow. What others dismissed as shyness was in fact the beginning of something far more dangerous, something that would eventually break through the surface and change the town forever. One autumn evening, the rhythm of the town was broken in a way no one could have imagined. The three girls, who had been seen walking together after a study session, did not return home. Their parents grew anxious as the hours passed. Calls went unanswered, messages remained unread, and the feeling of dread crept into the night. Families that usually trusted their children to wander safely through familiar streets now gathered on porches, scanning the dark roads for any sign of them. The small town that had always felt secure began to tremble under the weight of uncertainty. Police were called within hours. At first, they treated it as a possible case of teenagers staying out too late. But as midnight came and went, the concern turned into fear. Officers and volunteers searched parks, side streets, and the edges of the woods. Flashlights cut through the darkness as parents called their daughters' names, their voices cracking with panic. The town, which had so often been filled with laughter and calm, now echoed with shouts, sirens, and the restless movement of people desperate for answers. The search stretched into the early morning, and that was when everything changed. At the far edge of town, near an abandoned house that locals rarely visited, police found signs that drew them closer. Broken glass on the ground, faint traces that suggested someone had been there recently, and a door left slightly ajar. Inside, the air was cold and stale, filled with the weight of silence that only abandoned places carry. But silence quickly turned to horror. In the dim light of their flashlights, officers discovered the bodies of the three missing girls. The scene was devastating. Nothing about it was random. It was clear the person responsible had planned carefully, choosing a place where no one was likely to look. Evidence left behind suggested the girls had been lured there, not stumbled upon it by accident. The police realized they were not dealing with a crime of impulse, but with something calculated, someone who had been watching them long before that night. The ordinary lives of three young girls had been violently cut short, and the quiet town's belief in its own safety collapsed instantly. News of the discovery spread quickly. Parents clutched their children tighter. Friends of the victims wept openly in the streets, unable to believe that the girls who had been laughing in the hallways just days earlier were now gone forever. The high school became a place of mourning with lockers covered in flowers, notes, and photographs. Teachers who had once smiled with pride at their students now stood in shock, searching for words that didn't exist. Behind the scenes, investigators began piecing together the puzzle. The careful staging of the crime, the choice of location, and the disturbing attention to detail pointed to someone who had been fixated on the girls. This was no stranger passing through. The person responsible was someone they knew, someone who had walked the same halls, someone who had blended in so well that no one had ever thought to fear him. For the first time, the town realized that the threat had not come from outside, but from within. As investigators worked tirelessly to untangle the details of the crime, something even more chilling unfolded. The boy, no longer content with being hidden, turned to the one place where he knew he could be seen. Late one night, he started a live stream on YouTube. His face was barely visible in the dim light, only the glow of the screen outlining his features. Viewers stumbled across it by accident at first, clicking out of curiosity, expecting another random teenager streaming for attention. What they saw instead was something no one could ever forget. The stream began quietly, with him sitting in silence, breathing heavily, as if working up the courage to speak. Then, in a calm, almost flat tone, he started to describe what he had done. He spoke about the girls in a way that stripped them of their humanity, reducing them to objects he believed belonged to him. He explained how he had followed them, learned their patterns, and finally carried out the act that had consumed his thoughts for so long. There was no remorse in his voice, only a strange sense of triumph, as if the live stream was his stage and the audience his reward. At first, people watching thought it was some kind of twisted performance. The internet is full of disturbing content, and many assumed it was fake. But as he continued, providing details that matched the breaking news of the missing girls, the mood shifted. Comment sections filled with disbelief, panic, and desperate pleas for him to stop. Some viewers quickly reported the video to authorities, while others screen-recorded it, ensuring the footage would spread even after the stream ended. The boy didn't stop. He spoke about control, about finally being noticed, about how for once the world was paying attention to him. He leaned closer to the camera, his face pale and expressionless, describing moments of the crime with a disturbing calm. His words were chilling not just for their content, but for the way he delivered them, as though he had been rehearsing in his head for months. For him, this was not just a confession, it was a performance, one he believed would make him unforgettable. By the time police traced the stream to his location, thousands had already tuned in. The broadcast ended abruptly when officers entered, cutting off his voice mid-sentence, but the damage was done. The video spread across platforms within hours, watched and rewatched by people trying to make sense of what they had seen. Parents shielded their children from the footage, while news outlets debated how such a thing could happen live in real time with the world as an unwilling witness. The livestream turned the case into something larger than the town itself. It was no longer just a tragedy for one community, it became a chilling reminder of how obsession, violence, and technology could collide in the most horrifying way. What should have remained hidden in the dark corners of one boy's mind had been broadcast to millions, leaving behind a permanent scar on everyone who saw it. The livestream turned the case into something bigger than anyone could have imagined. What had started as a tragedy in one small town suddenly became an international story, drawing attention from people who had never even heard of the place before. News channels replayed clips of the broadcast, blurred and edited for television, while online forums filled with arguments about how something so horrific had been allowed to happen in real time. The boy's face, once unnoticed in the back of classrooms, was now everywhere. For many, it was impossible to reconcile the quiet teenager they barely remembered with the chilling figure who had spoken so confidently to a global audience. The community was left shaken to its core. Parents who had once trusted the safety of their neighborhood no longer allowed their children to walk alone. Teachers replayed old memories in their minds, wondering if they had overlooked warning signs that could have prevented the tragedy. Students who had passed him in the hallways struggled to understand how someone who had seemed so invisible could have been carrying such darkness inside. The high school became a place not only of grief but of suspicion, as everyone questioned how well they really knew the people around them. Court proceedings moved quickly, with the boy facing charges that ensured he would never return to ordinary life. Yet even as justice took its course, the story did not fade. The livestream had given it a permanent place in the digital world. Copies of the video circulated despite efforts to remove them, reappearing in hidden corners of the internet. For investigators, it was evidence. For others, it was a disturbing spectacle that should never have been shared. The question of responsibility stretched beyond the boy himself, raising concerns about the role of technology and how platforms could stop similar acts in the future. The victims were mourned in ways that showed the depth of their impact on the town. Candlelight vigils lit up the park, with hundreds gathering to remember them. Photos and messages covered walls and sidewalks, turning familiar spaces into memorials. Their absence was felt everywhere. In classrooms, on sports fields, and in the laughter that no longer echoed down the hallways. The sense of loss was overwhelming, but so was the determination to never forget them. Even with answers in the form of evidence, confessions, and court documents, one haunting question remained: why? Why had no one seen the danger? Why had an obsession been allowed to grow unchecked until it became deadly? People struggled with guilt, wondering if they had dismissed strange behavior too easily, if they had ignored moments that now seemed like clear warnings. The tragedy became not just about what had been done, but about what had been missed. In the end, the case was remembered as a lesson written in grief. It showed how obsession can fester unnoticed, how communities can blind themselves with the comfort of routine, and how technology can amplify darkness in ways never seen before. The small town that once prided itself on safety would never return to the innocence it once knew. The story remained like a scar, visible, painful, and unforgettable, a reminder of the dangers that can hide in plain sight.